You couldn't book this resort. You couldn't walk in. You couldn't even arrive by mistake. And yet, America's money future started here. Not in Washington, not in a public debate, not where history usually tells you decisions are made. Here on a quiet island off the Georgia coast, at first glance it looks harmless. Calm water, soft light, trees that seem more decorative than defensive. The kind of place that feels distant from conflict. But that feeling doesn't last. Because places like this aren't built for comfort. Comfort is just the surface. They're built for separation. And that brings us to the first question: why an island? An island does something very specific. It cuts you off from crowds, from interruptions, from the wrong people hearing the wrong things. It turns distance into a tool. On an island, access isn't assumed. It's granted. And that's important because when powerful people need to speak freely, what they want most isn't luxury. It's control over who is allowed to be present at all. Now look at this place again. It's beautiful, undeniably so. But beauty can be deceptive, because beauty doesn't explain why gates exist, or why entry isn't casual, or why membership mattered more than money. Which leads to the second question: why privacy? Not privacy in the sense of relaxation. Privacy in the sense of insulation. Privacy from scrutiny. Privacy from politics. Privacy from the public mood. This wasn't about hiding crimes. It was about hiding process. When decisions are still being shaped, when ideas are unfinished and fragile, visibility becomes a liability. And that's why this place mattered. Now consider the obvious alternative. Why not Washington? If what was being discussed would affect the entire country, why not meet where the country officially lives? Because Washington is noisy. Washington has rivals, schedules, reporters, witnesses. Even private rooms there exist inside a public ecosystem. And power doesn't always want to argue while it's still thinking. So instead of entering the Capitol, power stepped away from it. This island offered something Washington couldn't: a pause from accountability. Now here's where the perspective shifts. Up to this point, you've been seeing the island as scenery, as a peaceful retreat. But at the midpoint of this story, the mood changes. Because once you stop looking at the shoreline and start looking at who was allowed inside, the island stops feeling welcoming. You don't wander here. You don't explore. Your presence has to be justified. There are lists. There are permissions. There are doors that don't explain themselves. And if you don't belong, the island doesn't argue with you. It simply closes. That's the doorway moment, the realization that this wasn't a vacation space. It was a filter. And filters exist for one reason: to decide what passes through and what doesn't. Which brings us to the final question of this opening. Why does this still matter today? Because money systems don't stay in the past. They outlive buildings. They outlive people. They outlive secrecy. And when the foundations of those systems are laid far from public view, the debate about them never really ends. But we can't understand that yet, because the island itself wasn't the real story. The real story was happening somewhere else, in crowded cities, in fearful markets, in a country on the edge of panic. And that panic forced a meeting that couldn't happen in public. The island wasn't the story. The panic outside was. And that panic demanded a meeting that had to stay invisible. That's where this really begins. When people stop trusting banks, money becomes paper. And paper can't run an economy. That's the pressure you need to feel now, because this story doesn't begin on the island. It begins outside it, in crowded cities, in long lines, in moments when people realize, almost all at once, that trust is fragile. Banks don't work because vaults are full. They work because people believe their money will be there tomorrow. Take that belief away and the system doesn't slow down, it snaps. So ask the first uncomfortable question: what happens when everyone wants cash at once? The answer is simple and dangerous, Banks don't keep everyone's money on hand. They can't. The system assumes calm. It assumes timing. It assumes not everyone will panic together. But panic doesn't ask permission. When fear spreads, withdrawals pile up, credit freezes, and confidence collapses faster than any building ever could. And when that happens, the damage doesn't start at the top. Which brings us to the next question: who gets hurt first? Not the people with connections, not the people with early information. It's workers, small businesses, families who rely on access, not influence. The system is like a machine built on trust. As long as every part moves in rhythm, it looks stable. But once one part jams, the stress transfers fast to the weakest components. That's why panic terrifies elites more than scandal. Scandals can be denied. Panic spread on their own. So while the public saw headlines and lines outside banks, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. Lawmakers were under pressure, markets were unstable, and the demand was growing louder: fix the system. Congress debated, committees formed, ideas circulated, but public debate has a problem: it takes time. And time is the one thing panic doesn't give you. So here's the mid-pivot you need to notice. Congress demanded reform, but the reform wasn't written in Congress. Because writing a solution in public means arguing in public. It means compromise under cameras. It means letting fear shape policy in real time. And that's risky. Power prefers solutions that arrive already formed, clean, logical, defensible. Solutions that can be presented as answers, not experiments. So instead of trying to invent a system in the middle of chaos, the people with the most to lose chose a different path. They stepped away from the noise, away from reporters, away from rivals, away from a public that was watching too closely. Because if you're going to redesign how money behaves during a crisis, you can't do it while the crisis is screaming. The island wasn't chosen because it was beautiful. It was chosen because panic couldn't reach it. No crowds, no headlines drifting through open doors, no chance encounters. Just distance, time, and control. Why did they need secrecy so badly that even being overheard was a risk? Because when trust is breaking everywhere else, the smallest leak can become fuel. To write the rules that would calm the system, they needed a place where no one could interrupt, and no one could accidentally listen. And that's why the solution didn't start in Washington. It started where panic couldn't follow. To write it, they chose a place where no one could accidentally overhear. That's where the journey begins. They didn't travel like politicians. They traveled like people hiding something. No public schedules, no official delegations, no announcements explaining where they were going or why. Because the moment this meeting became visible, it would lose its power. After the panic outside reached its breaking point, the next step wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. No speeches, no votes, just movement. And that's the first thing to notice about how this meeting came together. Nothing about it looked important from the outside. Which raises the first question: why hide names? If this was about stabilizing the system, why not attach credit? Why not leave a trail of responsibility? Because names attract attention, and attention creates resistance. These men didn't want to arrive as officials. They didn't want to be recognized as representatives of institutions. They wanted to arrive as individuals, unremarkable, forgettable, invisible. Some traveled under assumed names. Some avoided telling colleagues where they were going. Some framed the trip as a vacation. Not because the trip was casual, but because the purpose couldn't be exposed yet. Which leads to the next question: why travel quietly? Because panic amplifies sound. At that moment, markets were fragile. Trust was thin. And any hint that a small group was designing a new system behind closed doors could have made things worse. Quiet travel wasn't about comfort. It was about containment. Every train ride, every dock, every transfer was designed to leave as little impression as possible. No crowds, no curiosity, no chance conversations. They weren't sneaking because they were weak. They were sneaking because they understood how quickly fear spreads. Now step past the postcard version of the island. Forget the porches and the shoreline for a moment. Because once they arrived, the island changed character. This wasn't a resort anymore. It became a workspace. Private rooms replaced open spaces. Movement was limited. Access was controlled. There were areas meant to be seen and areas that were not. We stepped past the showpiece rooms into the mechanics of secrecy. Closed doors, restricted zones, conversations that didn't echo. And here comes the third question. Why was the purpose disguised? Because the goal wasn't to debate ideas. It was to build a finished solution. Debates can happen later, arguments can happen later, but the design had to come first, fully formed. And design requires freedom. Freedom from interruption, freedom from posturing, freedom from having to defend unfinished thoughts. That's what the island provided. Not luxury, not isolation for its own sake, protection for the process. And here's where the story tightens. This wasn't an accidental gathering of smart people. It wasn't a casual exchange of opinions. Every person who made this journey was chosen deliberately. Different backgrounds, different institutions, different types of influence, politics, banking, treasury, private finance. Each one represented a lever, not overlapping, not redundant, complementary. And this is the moment where the thriller aspect locks in. Because once you understand that the travel was secret, the names were hidden, the purpose was disguised, you realize something unsettling. This meeting was never meant to be discovered while it was happening. It was designed to reveal itself only after the outcome was already locked in. The group wasn't random. It wasn't a gathering of opinions. It was a system in human form. A perfect set of levers assembled in a place where no one could interrupt and no one could listen. And now the only question left is, who exactly were they? And what did each of them bring to the table? That's where this becomes impossible to ignore. 6 men, 1 week, a plan that outlived the island. And if you want to understand why this meeting mattered, you don't start with theories. You start with the cast, because this wasn't a random group of smart people. It was a deliberately assembled machine made of influence. So as we go through them, keep 3 questions in your head every time a new name appears. What did he control? What did he fear? What did he want the system to do? First, Nelson Aldrich, a political heavyweight, a gatekeeper in Washington. What did he control? Access, legitimacy. The path a proposal takes to become law. What did he fear? A crisis big enough to turn into blame and blame turning into political fire. What did he want the system to do? Stabilize panic fast, without surrendering control to the crowd. Second, Paul Warburg, a strategist of banking systems, someone who thought in structure, not slogans. What did he control? The blueprint language, the architecture of how a central solution could work. What did he fear? A fragile, decentralized system collapsing under pressure again and again. What did he want the system to do? Create a reliable backstop, something that could respond when fear hits. Third, Frank Vanderlip, a bank executive with operational instincts. What did he control? Practical knowledge, how money moves in the real world when people are scared. What did he fear? Sudden runs, sudden freezes, sudden spirals that punish institutions and the public at the same time. What did he want the system to do? Keep liquidity moving, keep the gears from locking. Fourth, Henry P. Davison, a connector, a network man, the type who understands that power isn't only policy, it's coordination. What did he control? Relationships between finance and influence. the ability to align big players behind one direction. What did he fear? Disorder, conflicting interests, a solution dying because the people who matter refuse to cooperate. What did he want the system to do? Produce confidence, because confidence is a currency of its own. Fifth, A. Piatt Andrew. A link to the Treasury world, close enough to government to understand its limits. What did he control? Institutional perspective. What could be sold publicly, what could not? What did he fear? A plan that looks like a private takeover of public life. What did he want the system to do? Feel legitimate, because legitimacy prevents revolt. And sixth, Arthur Shelton. Not the loudest name, but often the most revealing role. What did he control? Logistics, communication, the quiet mechanics of the meeting itself. What did he fear? Exposure, leakage, the wrong detail becoming a headline at the wrong time. What did he want the system to do? Get built cleanly, before anyone had the chance to tear it apart. Now here's the part that matters. Individually, you can tell a reassuring story about each of them, that they were responding to instability, that they wanted to prevent collapse, that they were trying to make something stronger. And that may be true, but this story isn't about individual intentions. It's about combined leverage. Individually, they're impressive. Together, they're dangerous. Not because they're comic book villains, but because incentives stack. Politics wants stability. Banking wants backstops. Networks want coordination. Government wants legitimacy. Secrecy wants time. Put all of that in one room behind locked doors and you don't get a conversation. You get a design. And now the question isn't who they were. It's what they built quietly, deliberately behind locked doors. They weren't building a bank. They were building an emergency valve. That distinction matters, because a bank is something you visit. A valve is something you pull when pressure is about to explode. What these men were designing wasn't meant for normal days. It was meant for moments when fear moves faster than facts. So forget the idea of a new building or a new institution for a moment. Think in terms of function. When panic hits, three things happen at once. People rush for cash. Credit freezes, and trust quietly, invisibly evaporates. Their blueprint was meant to interrupt that chain reaction, not by calming people, not by speeches, but by changing what happens behind the scenes. So here's the first question, the one that turns curiosity into concern. Who controls the valve? Because an emergency valve sounds reassuring, until you realize someone has to decide when it opens. The idea was simple enough to explain without equations. When the system is under stress, liquidity must appear fast, not everywhere, not randomly, in the places where failure would spread the fastest, which leads to the next question. What happens when fear hits? In fear, timing matters more than fairness. The goal isn't to save everyone equally, it's to stop collapse from cascading. That's the uncomfortable trade-off built into the design. Stability for the public requires selective intervention behind the curtain. And that brings us to the third question, the one most people never get to ask. Who decides what gets saved first? Because deciding where help goes isn't neutral. It reflects priorities. It reflects assumptions, and it reflects who is sitting in the room when the decision is made. This is where the blueprint stops feeling abstract, because the men who designed it weren't guessing. They were planning from experience. They had seen what panic does. They had seen which failures spread fastest, and they wanted a mechanism that could move faster than public debate. So they designed a system that could act quietly, decisively, and, most importantly, without waiting for permission. Now here's the critical pivot, the point where admiration turns into tension. This plan couldn't survive daylight as written, not because it was illegal, not because it was chaotic, but because it concentrated power in a way the public would instinctively resist. A visible emergency valve invites questions. A visible selector invites outrage. So the blueprint had a problem. It worked best in the dark. That's where the beauty versus cost trade-off comes into focus. On the surface, the promise was stability, fewer panics, fewer collapses, a system that doesn't tear itself apart every time fear spikes. But underneath that promise sat control. Control over timing, control over access, control over who feels the shock and who is shielded from it. And control doesn't sell well in daylight. So the design needed a mask, not to change what it did, but to change how it was seen. And this is the moment where power does what it has always done best. It doesn't argue, it doesn't ask, it rebrands. The move that makes everything that follows possible. They didn't abandon the blueprint. They didn't dilute it. They did the most effective thing power can do. They disguised it. And once you understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. Disguised as what? That's where the story turns from design to presentation. The hardest part wasn't writing the plan. It was making the public accept it. Because once the blueprint existed, the danger didn't disappear, it changed shape. The threat was no longer panic. It was resistance. People don't fight what they don't see. But the moment they recognize control shifting, suspicion follows. And that brings us to the first shock. Shock 1. Political resistance. The plan that worked perfectly in isolation didn't survive contact with reality. Lawmakers had questions. Critics raised alarms. The word central alone was enough to trigger fear. Not fear of collapse, but fear of control. So the question becomes unavoidable. What had to change? The answer is uncomfortable but simple. The presentation had to change without touching the core. The system couldn't arrive as a takeover. It couldn't look like power concentrating. It had to look like balance. Which leads to the next question. What stayed the same? Everything that mattered. The emergency valve stayed intact. The ability to inject liquidity stayed intact. The speed critical in moments of fear stayed intact. What changed was the language, not central authority, not control, not command. Instead, words like reserve, stability, and coordination took center stage. This is where branding enters the story. And branding mattered more than truth. Because people don't evaluate systems, they evaluate stories about systems. And the story needed to feel familiar, decentralized, and safe. That's not deception in the dramatic sense. It's framing. But framing has consequences, which brings us to shock 2. Shock 2, exposure creates permanent suspicion. Here's the paradox. To pass the plan, secrecy was necessary, but secrecy doesn't vanish when the law passes, it lingers. And when people eventually realize something was hidden, they don't forget it. They build a second narrative. This is the mid-pivot, the point where the story splits. And here's the problem with secrecy. It creates a second story. The official story says the system was built to prevent collapse, and that's true. But the unofficial story asks different questions. Who benefits first? Who decides in silence? And why wasn't this debated openly? Once that second story exists, it never disappears. It mutates. It resurfaces during every crisis, every bailout, every emergency intervention. And now the public is no longer reacting to the system itself. They're reacting to what they suspect about it. This is the long shadow of disguise. The plan passed, the system stabilized, and the emergency valve worked. But trust, once bent, never returns to its original shape. Because when people discover that something foundational was hidden, even temporarily, they don't stop asking questions. They start connecting dots. They start watching decisions more closely. And they start wondering whether stability came at a price they were never asked to agree to. Which brings us to the final tension driving this story forward. Because once people learned something was hidden, they never stop asking why. And that question, more than panic, is what still haunts the system today. If it was for stability, why did it need an island? That question hangs in the air longer than any statistic, because by now you understand the logic, you've seen the pressure, you've met the people, you've watched the plan take shape and then put on a public face. And yet the island is still there, not as scenery, as a choice. So let's surface the question that never quite gets asked out loud. Was this protection or control? Because those two ideas can look identical from the outside. Both promise order, both promise safety, both say they exist to prevent collapse. The difference only appears when you ask who decides. That's why this moment matters. Because an emergency tool sounds neutral until it's used. And once it exists, it doesn't disappear after the emergency ends. Was it an emergency tool or a power tool? The system they built could move faster than fear. That's the argument in its favor. Speed prevents panic from becoming disaster, but speed also bypasses debate. When decisions happen quickly, they don't happen equally. Someone goes first. Someone gets shielded. Someone absorbs the shock. Which brings us to the third question, the one that divides audiences even today. Was this for the public good or a private design? Because the benefits were real. The system stabilized markets. Crises didn't spiral the way they once did. But the structure was also selective, designed by a small group, activated by a few hands, and explained after the fact. This is where the tension settles into your gut, because nothing about this story is simple enough to judge cleanly. If they hadn't acted, collapse might have been worse. If they had acted openly, resistance might have killed the solution. If they had waited, panic might have spread faster than law. And yet, secrecy always leaves a residue, which is why this origin story never stays in the past. This origin story is why the debate never ends. Every time the system steps in during a crisis, people don't just see the action. They remember the island. They remember that this wasn't born in daylight. They remember that the first draft happened behind gates, not microphones. And so the arguments resurface. Is this stability or influence? Is this coordination or concentration? Is this necessary power or convenient power? That's why this story refuses to settle. Because it isn't about whether the system works. It's about whether the way it was created still matters. And now comes the part that turns this from history into something almost cinematic. Because the island itself, the place built for silence, couldn't keep its gates closed forever, people started asking questions. Records surfaced. Stories leaked. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for the island to lose its invisibility. Enough for the meeting to stop being a rumor and start becoming a reference point. And once that happens, control over the story disappears, which leaves us at the edge of the final act. Because when something designed in secrecy becomes public knowledge, it doesn't get judged only on results. It gets judged on intent. And that's the unresolved tension that still follows this system today. If it was truly only about stability, why did it need an island? The club itself couldn't keep the gates closed forever. That's where the last piece waits. The island eventually opened, but power doesn't retire, it relocates. That's the quiet ending of the Jekyll Island Club, not a dramatic collapse, not a scandal that burned it down overnight, just a slow erosion. What ended the club era? The world changed. The age of private railcars and sealed telegrams gave way to mass politics. Newspapers got louder. Transparency became a demand, not a suggestion. An island designed for silence became impractical. And then came the second pressure. What changed in the world? The very system born on the island succeeded. Ironically, stability reduced the need for secrecy in that specific place. Banking became centralized. Coordination became institutional. Crisis response moved into formal structures. The club no longer needed to exist because its purpose had already been fulfilled. That's how places like this usually end, not with exposure, with obsolescence. The Jekyll Island Club didn't fall because people discovered the meeting. It faded because the meeting no longer needed that room. So the gates opened, the exclusivity dissolved, and the private paradise became something else entirely. Which brings us to the meaning flip. A private paradise became public property. The same halls that once hosted whispered drafts and locked doors now welcomed tourists, historians, and school groups. The place changed purpose. The building remained, the ocean remained, but the function was gone. What survived? Not the club, the system. The emergency valve still exists. The ability to act faster than fear still exists. The structure that bypasses debate during crisis still exists. Only now it doesn't need an island. And that's the part most people miss. Because this story was never really about Jekyll Island. The island was a container, a temporary solution to a specific problem. Once the solution worked, the container became irrelevant. Which means the most important question isn't what happened to the club. It's what happened after. Because if this was the first closed ledger, the first place where decisions were made quietly to prevent collapse, then the uncomfortable question follows naturally. Where did the next meeting happen? Not geographically, structurally. Behind what doors? Inside which institutions? Under what names? That's why this story doesn't end cleanly. It resolves the place but not the logic. When you think back to the island, the secrecy, the pressure, the design was this necessary protection or private control. And before you answer, consider this. If panic returned tomorrow, would you want the valve to exist? And if you say yes, who do you trust to pull it? Because the island opened. The club disappeared, but power didn't. It learned how to move without a location. And once you see that, every earlier scene changes meaning. The gates, the ledgers, the silence, not as history, but as a blueprint. If this was the first closed ledger, where did the next meeting happen?